Migration Conversations is a podcast that invites persons to share their migration stories. Hosted by myself, Professor Jamie Liu, each episode is an in-depth conversation with people who have experienced the Canadian immigration system or other migration regimes up close. We talk to migrants, immigrants, lawyers, policymakers, advocates, and experts. We hope that these conversations shed light on the challenges migrants face through their own voices. So welcome everyone. On today's episode, we will be talking about refugee resettlement in Canada. And to talk about this from a historical and from a contemporary perspective, we'll be talking to one of the key players in launching parts of this program 40 years ago. My guest today is Mike Molloy. Mike Molloy served as coordinator of the Middle East peace process at the Department of Foreign Affairs from 2000 to 2003. And was previously Ambassador of Canada to Jordan. During a long career at the Department of Immigration, Mike was involved firsthand in the Czech and Ugandan refugee movements, oversaw the implementation of the refugee provisions of the 1976 Immigration Act, and coordinated the resettlement of 60,000 Indochinese refugees in Canada in 1979 to 1980. He has served in Japan, Lebanon, Minneapolis, Geneva, Jordan 2 times, Syria, Kenya, and was the Director General of Citizenship and Immigration in Ontario. Welcome, Mike. Thank you so much for making time for us today. Before we begin, I wanted to ask if you had any advice for students wanting to pursue a career in public service and the foreign service. Now, many of the listeners of this podcast are students, and I'm sure many are wondering, how did you embark on such an illustrious career, and what advice you would have for students today?
Well, there's a big difference between the way I got in over 50 years ago and the reality today. I just applied, and to my astonishment, I got a call from my mother one day saying, Ottawa's looking for you, but your father told me to tell them we didn't know where you were. And when the Mounties came to do the security check, the whole neighborhood closed down. You know, we were mountain people in BC.
It was an event, was it?
But I was really fortunate in what was it, 1968. I was doing graduate studies at the University of Saskatchewan, had an interview with somebody, and that was about it. And then I eventually got a call and joined a class of 27 people, 1/3 of them women back in those days, which was really quite unusual. And after a year's training, which included some time dealing with Czech refugees on a training skit in Vienna, I got posted to Japan and all those other places. I think today, you need at a minimum, you need a master's degree before they'll even look at you. And I cannot tell you how important it is to have your French or your English, depending, and how useful it is to have a solid foundation in a third language. Training people to Foreign Affairs realized rather late that it was really, really important that our young officers acquire, beyond our 2 official languages, at least one other. And the time taken to perfect another language is well spent. At times, when they're recruiting for either immigration or Foreign Affairs and CEDA are now together, and the Trade Department are all in there together. You can get 8,000 to 10,000 people writing the exam. So you have to find ways to distinguish yourself. Having some experience working abroad which shows that you can operate abroad, is really also a big asset. So if you spend a year in Cameroon or someplace like that, that's something that they look for too, because there are people who historically have joined the Foreign Service, gone abroad, and discovered that they really didn't like it, couldn't cope. So, but I think there's no substitute for having both official languages under your belt and a third one.
That's excellent advice, and not quite what I was expecting from you, but I think it's very useful for students to know, and something very practical that they can take on right now as they're studying and going through their studies.
If I can say just one other thing.
Mm-hmm.
For the longest time, Foreign Service recruited on the basis solely of academic excellence. And we ended up with an organization filled with introverts as a result. And yet diplomacy is a very public thing. And so really, it's really important to show that you have either participated in student government, you volunteered, that you are not just somebody who's worrying about what's in the books. These days we're looking for people who can go and speak in public, can negotiate, can get out there and mix it up. And that's a very important skill to have. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. And those are things, you're right, that can be learned, but really someone should be aware of whether their personality or their inclinations to work in that kind of environment fit with their own personal goals. So thank you, Mike. So our topic today, as I said, is the Refugee Resettlement Program and how this program was created. I wondered if you could just give us a brief historical account of how this program came to be in Canada and how it was deployed very well during the 1970s.
Okay. Well, very quickly, we have to go back a bit to get the full thing, but I'll do it as quickly as I can. From the beginning of the Depression in 1930 to the end of the Second World War, there was almost no immigration to Canada. In fact, the Immigration Department was tucked away in the Department of Mines, of all places. When the war ended, the big trick was to bring home 1 million Canadian soldiers, sailors, and airmen. So there was nobody going to resettle refugees or anyone else for that first year or two. But eventually, as it became clear, and I think it was in 46 or 47, when it became clear that the Canadian economy was really benefiting from the fact that it had not been destroyed, whereas much of the industry of the rest of the world had been. There was immediately a serious labor shortage. Now, it's really ironic. You bring home 1 million soldiers and there's still a labor shortage. So that says something about the strength of the Canadian economy at that time. So Mackenzie King made his notorious statement about the population of Canada not going to change in its content, but he also said, very interesting, that he felt Canada had a moral duty to help out with the displaced people in Europe, and that we didn't have a legal obligation, but we had a moral one, and we're going to do something about it. And within a month of his statement, something called the Canadian Government Immigration Mission was sent off to Europe. And over the course of the next 3 years, they brought to Canada 163,000 displaced people. And in fact, I'm sad to tell you that the last member of that team, Mr. Roger St. Vincent, died last month at the age of 98. So he's our last link with that time. So the government then decided that aside from people trickling out of the Soviet Empire, that the refugee problem was solved, and they said, I guess in 1953, we're not even going to bother to report the statistics anymore. Well, of course, along came 1956 with the Soviet crushing of the Hungarian revolt, and all of a sudden we're taking in 36,000 Hungarian refugees, and a lot of other people are seeping out of Eastern Europe, and so we continue to take them on a sort of an ongoing basis. Canada had decided not to sign the Refugee Convention that was in 1951 because of a misunderstanding about whether or not you could, the convention allowed you to keep out security risks and criminals. But by 1969, the country, under the Trudeau government, the country was feeling confident enough, the government was feeling confident, that in 1969, we signed the Refugee Convention. 2 years before that, 1967, the convention had been made universal with a protocol. The original convention focused exclusively on European refugees. 67, it was expanded. Oddly enough, 67, Canada brought in the point system, and our immigration program became universal as the Refugee Convention became global. But up to that point, refugee policy was just people who were running away from the Soviet Empire, refugees, point final, nobody else. In 69, we signed the convention, and the following year, the government sat down and said, okay, we need a refugee policy, and the policy will be the following. One, we will use the UN Convention to determine who's a refugee, the famous definition about well-founded fear of persecution. We will use the point system, but officers are reminded that they have positive discretion and can override the point system. We will be now open to looking at refugees from anywhere in the world. And we're going to even have something called an oppressed minority policy that allows us to go into a country before people have fled and winkle them out if they're in real difficulty. So immediately after, so that's 1970. And over the next 5 years, we took Tibetans, we took the Ugandan Asians, we took Chileans and Latin Americans, and we took the first wave of the Indochinese. By 1975, the government realized that the Immigration Act that had been passed in 1952, which had us keep out idiots, imbeciles, and morons, among other, and was, homosexuals not admitted, people who live in unusual places or poverty in unusual ways are not admitted, just a way of keeping everybody out. In fact, you can go through that whole 51 Act and try and find something about who's allowed in. That was totally at the discretion of the minister. But by 75, it was clear we needed something. There was a long process, a long consultative process with a lot of people involved. We had a really good minister by the name of Bob Andrews in charge of it. And so in 1976, the 1976 Immigration Act passed. And for the first time, the refugee definition was in the law. Meeting our international obligations was in the law as an objective. And more to the point, there was a provision that we would set up a formal class for convention refugees that we found in refugee camps abroad. And we had also the capacity to create what were called designated classes. So if the convention definition didn't fit, we could propose to the government, okay, we want to help this group of people. They don't fit the convention this way, but they need resettlement for other reasons. Can we take them? And we actually ended up with being allowed to develop 3 designated classes, one for Indochinese refugees, one for people still fleeing Europe, and one for people still in their own countries, okay? So all that was in the nub of those things were in the law. In addition to which, there was about a 10-word clause that hinted that we could sponsor relatives and we might even be able to sponsor refugees. So on the basis of those little words, well, my section, which was called the Refugee Policy Division, which consisted of me and one other officer, developed the selection criteria for convention refugees, for the designated classes, and we designed something called the Private Sponsorship Program. So the changes were so drastic that even though the Act passed in 76, the government gave us 2 years till 1978 to get everything in place, because we had to revive everything. Right down to the forms, right down to the training, right down to the manuals, the regulations, everything. And this was one of those instances of just-in-time policy, because in the fall of 1978, as the second wave of refugees from Indochina began to cross the borders from Cambodia in large numbers into Thailand, fleeing Laos across the Mekong River the same way, and the boat people phenomenon reached the point where by I guess it was June of 79, 60,000 people a month were coming out, and a third more were drowning on the way. So this was drowning time. Anyways, all of the pieces, the sponsorship program, the designated class, everything else we need were ready by December 1978, when the cabinet sat down for the first time and said, okay, we've been doing nickel and dime programs. Now we have to get serious. And they initially said in December 79, under Trudeau, the last months of the second Trudeau government, or the first Trudeau government, pardon me, we want the Immigration Department to bring 5,000 people from Southeast Asia. So got started on that. And and then, of course, the Joe Clark Conservatives won the election, booted Mr. Trudeau out, and two remarkable ministers were in the cabinet. One was Flora MacDonald, the first woman to become Foreign Minister of Canada, and a lawyer from Toronto by the name of Ron Atke. And both Atke and MacDonald were seized with and were extremely interested in us doing more for the boat people and the other refugees out of Indochina, out of Laos and Cambodia as well. So their first act in June, the month they took, they got in their ministries, was to ask what was happening. We said we've got 5,000 and a reserve of 3,000. So they said, okay, we're now committed for 8,000. And oh, by the way, there are some signs that this sponsorship program is actually beginning to take part and to happen. We'd signed deals with the Mennonites and 3 other churches in April. And by the end of May, they'd sponsored 1,200 people. Really quite amazing. So they said, okay, the government's going to take 8,000, but wouldn't it be great if private groups would take 4,000? Now that's in June. I remember somebody coming from UNHCR and saying, this is very wonderful, guys, but it is not enough. You have no idea how big the problem is. It's worse than anything we've seen since the Second World War. And there's going to be a conference in July. We'd sure like you to do more. So again, MacDonald and Atke went to cabinet in early July with an outrageous proposal that we bring in 60,000 people, 60,000. And then it was realized that Joe Clark had run on the promise of getting rid of 60,000 civil servants. So the 60,000 number was taboo. So what came out of cabinet was 50,000. They said, we've got 8,000 in the pipeline already. So if the private sector will bring in 21,000, the government will match it with 21,000, and that'll get us 50,000 refugees in this year.
Can I pause you for a second, Mike?
Yeah.
I wondered if you could just maybe go back a little bit and just tell us a little bit more about the conflict that created the crisis, the refugee crisis.
Okay.
And then just briefly on that, and then also if you could just talk about how it attracted Canada's attention. I mean, literally was on the other side of the world. And why did Canada care so much? How did it get involved in this way? I mean, so far what you've described is a remarkable response, but I would love to hear how this crisis was created and why Canada cared.
Okay. There was about, I guess, 40 years of war in what in those days was called French Indochina, which were the 3 countries that had been conquered by the French in the previous century. So that's Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The Japanese came in during the Second World War, booted out the French. The French came back after the Second World War and wanted to take it over. In the meantime, in Vietnam, there were a lot of people who said, no, we're going to be our own country. And the communists by the name of Ho Chi Minh organized resistance. The result was that Vietnam was partitioned, the north part being communist, the southern part being free, whatever that means. And for the first year, people were allowed to move one way or another. 100,000 people, mainly communist activists, went north. 1 million people came south. And then began a war as the North decided they wanted to unify, have one Vietnam under their rule. And there was a long, first of all, there was a 7-year war to get rid of the French. And that was no sooner over than the Civil War started between the North and the South. That went on for 18 years. The Americans backed the South, the Russians and the Chinese backed the North. Millions and millions of people were internally displaced in the course of those wars. But interestingly, no Vietnamese, no Cambodian, no Laotians went outside the area and said, hey, I'm a war refugee. Absolutely remarkable. People were really attached to their own countries. They would move to get out of the way of the fighting, They would move to get out of a zone that had a government didn't like. But nobody was fleeing, running away from the country. Well, eventually the Americans got tired of the war. They lost the will to fight, and they withdrew. And within 3 years, the North Vietnamese had conquered the country. So that in April 1975, Northern Vietnamese tanks rolled into the southern capital of Saigon, and the Saigon government surrendered, and a new day began. Now, 130,000 people tried to escape at that time, mainly by boat, some by air, but mainly by boat. And those that managed to survive were picked up by the Americans, who brought them to first to Philippines, and then to Guam and Wake Island. Look those up, guys. And then ultimately to camps in the all across the American South. The Canadian government didn't think there would be any reason for us to intervene, but in April, just before Saigon fell, a group of students, Vietnamese students from Montreal, showed up on Parliament Hill in quite large numbers, scared the living daylights out of the government. And a friend of mine was told by the minister, go down and find out what they want and agree to anything that's reasonable. So what it was, I mean, these were people on student status, really. They didn't have a residency, but they were worried sick about their relatives. So the government said to them, 1, we are going to give you permanent resident status. 2, we want to know the names of your relatives. 3, we're going to keep our immigration offices open around the clock at 7 days a week until you've all come in and given us your relatives' names, and we will try and get them. So that's what got it started. Now, the reality was that we had 4 Canadians at the embassy in Saigon, and all of a sudden these, what were called telexes, kind of the emails of the day, started arriving in Saigon with ultimately 17,000 names of relatives of these 1,000 or so students in Canada. And the immigration office, we had immigration people in Hong Kong. They all came in, tried to help. The problem was that probably the last thing to crumble as South Vietnam was conquered were the border controls. And they wouldn't let people out unless they had both a passport and an exit permit from the government. So we were actually able to extract very few people at that time. But nevertheless, we had this list of names. And when people fled, the first group were picked up by a Scandinavian freighter and deposited in Hong Kong, where the British put them in a Gurkha military camp because the Gurkhas were so well organized. And the Canadian embassy, without instructions from our headquarters and without so much as a buy your leave to the British government in Hong Kong, went, set up a tent, got a tent from the Gurkhas, put a flag on it, and said, if you're interested, Canada, we're for you. And they found in that the 4,000 or 5,000 people that had been rescued, quite a number that either had Canadian links or the like. So at the same time, we learned that the Americans had rescued all these people at sea and deposited them in Guam. You know where Guam is? It's not the end of the world, but you can see it clearly from there. It's way out there somewhere, and there were World War II military bases there, so they plunked this huge number of people there. And so our gang in Hong Kong upped stakes and went out to and took over a hut in this camp. And over the next couple of weeks, they moved about 2,000 people to Canada. Anybody who had any kind of a link was accepted. Then the monsoons were coming, so the Americans picked them up and dumped them in all these camps across the southern United States. So Canadian teams out of Los Angeles for those on the West Coast, and out of various other places for the 4 or 5 camps in the eastern United States, went in, always looking for relatives. Now, the government said as Saigon fell, 1, anybody with a relative in Canada, we're going to take. And oh, by the way, Immigration Department, we're giving you a quota of 3,000 for anybody else that is interested, and we'll consider them convention refugees. So in that first, between the fall of Saigon in April 1975 and the end of the year, we moved 7,000 people to Canada. Most would be, no, approximately slightly more than half had relatives, slightly less than half didn't. So we got hooked into this, the issue, because we had students in Canada. That was the original hook, and the government responded very, very actively to the worries of those students. I mean,
That's a fascinating story. It also speaks to how advocacy can really
yeah,
alert the government of an issue or push a government to do something. Um, as I'm listening to you, and as I've listened to you in the past, a lot of this story reminds me of how quickly things moved, but also how innovative policymakers were to respond to this crisis. And you describe this in your book quite well, but I wondered if you could describe how quickly the program was created, and how did you manage to create these innovative processes, and what were the challenges in doing that, but also what did that flexibility give you as tools to respond to a crisis that might not be as easily done today?
Well, in a really big crisis, when the government wants it, the civil service, has a tendency to deliver. There's a long tradition here. In our case, we were really lucky that between the first wave in '75 and after which things kind of died down for a year or two, we had that 2 years to get ready. And even though there was my boss, myself, and a fantastic officer now dead, unfortunately, by the name of Carla Thorlickson. And we were it. But I'd served in Uganda. I'd served with the Czech refugee thing. I thought a lot about it. I knew I didn't want a rigid system. I wanted to flex. We needed a better framework, and we needed better tools. We didn't need rigidity, because you can make all the rules you want, but what happens in the world is you don't. I always say with refugees, you don't get what you want, you get what you get. So what we and the designated class idea was really a brilliant innovation of the time, because for example, with the Vietnamese, we had a small crew out in Singapore and another group in Hong Kong that were picking up the odd family and this sort of stuff, but they were reporting and telling us what they were seeing. And the more I learned from them, the more I realized what could be more ridiculous when these boats come in. We know that one boat in 3 or 4 doesn't make it. So when people start out, they know they've got 1 chance in 3 of surviving. These are people who didn't run away during the war, but they hated the communist system so much they were running away. And the communists were really clamping down by this stage. They executed 100,000 people within the first few months, and hundreds of thousands more starved to death in various new economic zones and re-education camps and that sort of thing. And when you're dealing with the convention refugee, you have obligations under the convention that cut both ways, because our decisions implicate the whole world. Everybody else who signed the convention is bound by our decisions. So you have to take time, and even if you're sitting in the middle of a refugee camp, to do it properly takes at least 45 minutes. But when our gang first got out there, after Saigon fell, or just before Saigon fell, and we had that original target of 5,000. Well, the guy who went out and did it, he said, "Look, Mike, to get these people through in time, we got 12 minutes per case, and right now we're doing 2 minutes of talking to them and 10 minutes of filling in forms." And he said, it's killing us. He says the paperwork is killing us. So when we designed the designated class idea, we did 3 things. First of all, we said the definition won't be the convention definition. The definition is, if you're from Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia, and you left your country after April 1975, and nobody else has taken you, and you're interested in Canada, that's our definition. It takes about 2 seconds to apply that. So that was the first thing. The other thing was that when we redid the refugee system, we said the idea behind the point system, looking at something, can they settle successfully? Well, age, education, that's all fine, but we don't want points. We want a holistic appreciation. Look at the whole family. Look at the kids. Look at are there relatives in Canada? You know, and it's one of the officers said, one of the really influential ones said, look for the twinkle in their eye. You know, so we were able to, first of all, get a definition, unlike the Americans, unlike the Australians, that was cut specifically to what we were seeing there. And what we were seeing were people who were running away, who were risking their lives, who were dying in the tens of thousands to get away. And so the business of are they convention refugees or are they not convention refugees was not relevant. I mean, they'd risk their lives to get away. And so that was the first thing that we were able to do. Second, when Jerry Campbell came back from dealing with that first 5,000 and talked to us about the 12 minutes to fill in, 10 minutes to fill in the forms and 2 minutes to talk to the person. I took him immediately up to see the deputy minister, Mr. Jack Mannion. And Mannion had run the Hungarian program 20 years before when they threw the book away. And Mannion listened to Jerry, and he immediately picked up the phone and called somebody who was in charge of administrative matters in the department, brought him in and said, before the end of the week, we want Jerry's problem solved. So we ended up with a special form that where you captured the data of the family, tore off the bottom and gave them a stub that had the file number on it. When you went back, you filled in past medical, past security, ready to go, and the top copy became the visa, all done by hand. No typing, no duplication, and the idea was that the formal documents for landing would be done once they'd arrived in Canada at our 2 reception centers. The third thing that happened that was what caught us a surprise was the way the Canadian population picked up on the sponsorship thing once the government said we're going to take a lot of these people. And in May, we've had 1,200 people sponsored. That's May. By the end of August, we had over 10,000. By October, they've surpassed the 21,000 that the government had asked for. Well, the sponsorships were piling in. The lists of people coming on airplanes were piling in. And so we needed to come up with a system. We need to do 2 things. One, we needed a system that would allow us to get the sponsors and the incoming people together quickly. Nobody knew anybody. These were strangers coming to strangers, not like Syria, where a lot of people came in because they had links and connections with Canada. These were Vietnamese strangers or Laotian strangers meeting Canadian strangers. So we set up a system where not to get any complicated, but 5 days before the plane took off, we knew who was going to be on it. That list was sent right across Canada. People in various parts of Canada, part of the matching center, would decide who was going to go to what sponsorship on the basis of, I have no idea what. And before the wheels touched down, 80% of the people on that plane would have sponsors. And then we realized that, again, we were drowning in paper. And so and in those times, nobody had computers, there were no cell phones, there were no computers, nothing like that. So anyways, but there were computers out there. So I put in a requisition for one. And and a very nasty lady from somewhere in the department came and said, there are dozens and dozens of people ahead of you. And if you think you're going to get a computer just because you're dealing with these refugees, it's over my dead body. So we were very polite to her and sent her on her way. And I took all these incoming telegrams and all the sponsorships and put them in a shopping cart and went up to Mr. Mannion's office and said, "This is our problem, sir. We need a computer." And he said, "What's the problem?" I said, "Mrs. So-and-so says we can't have one. You leave her to me." Well, next week we had a computer, and it came with its own nerd, which was really interesting. I'd never seen a nerd before. I'd never seen a computer or a nerd. We got 2 for the price of 1. And what that thing allowed us to do was to, well, let me tell you, I went down to see how this thing worked, and the nerd tried to explain to us how it worked, and he wasn't speaking any language I'd ever understood. And so finally he got a little bit frustrated. He went over to one of the people who were doing the matching, and he came back with a roll of what's called ticker tape. It's a long, thin tape with little dots, little holes in it. He said, "You know what this is?" I said, "Yeah, that's ticker tape." He said, "Know what it's for?" "Yeah, you throw it out the window for parades." I said, "No, watch this. So to my amazement, there was a little slot in the top of the computer. And he stuck the end of the tape and it went into the computer. And across the room, a typewriter with nobody sitting at it started to type what was on that ticker tape. And once we had that capacity to move things without retyping all the paperwork, we were able to match everybody that came in. And the real trick was we said, look, whatever's left over at the end of any flight, that will be a government refugee. Whoever we can get to a sponsor will be a sponsored refugee. The government will do its share, the sponsors will do its share, but the sponsors get served first. So these were all kinds of things that we did, and the basic system was designed very carefully over a 2-year period where we had our experience. We talked to the NGOs, we talked to all sorts of other people, and we got the fundamentals with the designated classes and the shape of the sponsorship system right. But then in implementing it, we really had to run and find all sorts of ways of doing it. And when Mr. Mannion authorized the setting aside of all the normal immigration paper and blessed that 2-sheet form that could be filled in by hand, would turn into the visa, and reduce the paperwork by something like 70% on a sponsorship. The message that sent to our officers that the sacred paperwork was set aside was just astonishing, because then they understood that this was a time for innovation. And there was a kind of a sense that when people in the field came to us and said there's a problem, our first response to them was, what would you like to see as the solution? Not to say, sit down with my people at headquarters and say, well, they've got a problem, let's solve it. We'll go back to them and say, if you could solve it, if you could be the fairy godmother, what would you ask for? And they would then come back and say, well, we can use this, that, and we would give them that. And the ministers, we had Ron Atke first, and then when the Conservatives fell, we had Lloyd Axworthy. Ministers were extremely supportive, and the senior officials were extremely supportive. And there was something amazingly exhilarating knowing that in the summer of 79 and into the winter of 80, a huge portion of the Canadian population was involved in sponsorship, if not directly hands-on, put money in the collection plate to support it. And we figured at one stage that the sponsorship program touched the lives of probably 1.5 million Canadians.
Yeah,
and we had those kind of allies. It was really amazing, Really amazing.
It's a remarkable story. I think it's remarkable, I would say from the legal standpoint of just how innovative policymaking can be and how responsive it can be to the realities or the challenges on the ground, but also innovative in the way that you conceive of solving a crisis. And I think it's a testament to, like you said, the public service, but also the political will behind it. It shows that political will really makes a difference. I wanted to shift a little bit to how the Refugee Resettlement Program has evolved. You have seen it from the beginning, but, after the Indochinese Refugee Resettlement movement, it kind of evolved into a different kind of program. And I wanted you to comment on what the program turned into, and then leading up to the Syrian refugee crisis, how it became part of the public imagination again during the Syrian refugee crisis. I wondered if you could comment on how the program has changed from then to now.
Well, that's 40 years of changes and a whole series of different governments and three. It's interesting that the 1976 Immigration Act and the resettlement provisions of it lasted until the current. And there was the Canadian Immigration Act was this 1976 Act was amended a few times, but the fundamentals of the resettlement program were never touched, because it was feeling the designated classes, the way the sponsorship worked, the structure of how a refugee was to be interviewed and sponsored. That stayed in place for 30 years, which is really quite something, when you think about it. But there were waves. the Indochinese program left us with a much larger pro-refugee constituency in Canada, and a much larger group of people who cared about it, both from a policy and advocacy point of view, but also from a we want to be involved. I mean, there are churches in Canada that have not stopped sponsoring refugees since then. You know, they're into the 50th year of sponsoring refugees. Now, the numbers obviously, you know, once we got this, well, what happened was when Mr. Axworthy came in, he bumped it up to 60,000, which allowed us to do a lot of things we couldn't have done. We really welcomed that. But once the 60,000 was done, we retired, and the population, the sponsoring population retired, and so things went down. But if you look at the curves over the last couple of years, there were waves of interest in sponsorship. So there are peaks and valleys. The study done on the sponsorship program 12 years ago came up with a really interesting bit of analysis, because the two researchers found that once they looked at what was happening in Canada and what was happening, they said, look, there are four main players in the refugee resettlement game. This is, of course, before Mr. Trump changed the American. The most important is the American government, which brings people in and puts them onto sponsors who only look after them for 6 weeks. That's the biggest. The second biggest is the government of Australia. The third biggest are the Canadian sponsors. The fourth biggest is the government of Canada. And after that, there's nothing but peanuts, okay? So what does that tell you? It tells you that in the sponsorship program, we have something that is very local and very granular. It doesn't deal with anything abstract. It's that refugee family going to that sponsoring group in that community and bringing with them all their problems. And so you have that. On the other hand, the numbers are such is that what the UNHCR looks at it as one of its major assets, because it is at that stage 10 years ago, it was the third largest way of getting refugees resettled in the world. So it's a local program that has an amazingly global reach. Now, so we had this series of ups and downs, ups and valleys, but over time, I think some remarkable things happened. When I first came back to Canada to work in the Refugee Policy Division, it was 3 years after the fall of the Allende government in Chile. And the government had said, well, you know, it was going to be a communist government, so what do we care? Well, it turned out a lot of people in Canada care. And there was 5 or 6 years of headbanging between the people who cared and the government. And I can show you the scars myself if you want. But that process made the government much more attuned to the protection aspect of resettlement and its importance. And it made them, and I remember at one stage after a particularly difficult session with a group of the advocates up from Toronto, I sort of looked at my boss and he said, well, you know, Michael, they're actually pushing us where we want to go. And once I realized that was true, it became possible to work with them. Now, one of the things, but still, there was a new group of people came in after as a result of the Indochina program that didn't have that fundamental sense of the government is evil and we're good and nothing will ever change. And what astonished me when I finally came back to Canada after a whole series of other assignments in the year 2000 was that there's a whole different relationship between the people in Canada that are interested in refugee resettlement and the government. There are all sorts of mechanisms for consultation. The government listens, government makes its decisions, but they listen, they explain. There's frequent interchanges, just as there are frequent interchanges with the UN and the other countries do it. So I think one of the legacies of Indochina was that we end up with there'll always be disagreements about cases or about why are you taking this group and not taking that group, but there's a fundamental understanding. I think there's a much more maturity on the side of the government, people in the government, and much more maturity on the side of the people in the advocacy group, that we are in this together, and if we can work things out together, the refugees benefit. Now, I think one of the fundamental changes that took place in when the ERPA came in was that the designated class idea was dropped. The thing about the designated classes was we would essentially say, okay, here's a group of these are the circumstances that we're the definition we're going to use, and we would attach a table to it saying, and these are the countries that it applies. Citizens of these countries is what it applies to. I think governments and probably the people at Foreign Affairs didn't like the idea that we were naming the people. So now we have I guess two descendants of the designated classes that are much more generic, and I don't think they have the punch that ours did. I mean, I guess I take a fairly militant view of the following situation. When country X is treating its people so badly that we have to go and get them, or they show up on our doorsteps asking for asylum, we have a right to comment on their internal affairs. People say, "Oh well, you can't interfere." They're interfering with us by creating situations where we have to take people that they should be protecting and protect them in Canada. So I personally don't have any difficulty at all with the notion of pointing fingers at regimes that are mistreating the people. I think the current system is a little more discreet with a kind of generic definition. I like the idea of actually putting on the shoulders of cabinet the decision that, okay, the circumstances in this country are bad. Here's a definition of what's going. Please give us the authority to deal with it. That seems to be muted. On the other hand, when you look at the Syrian, the way the department and the government as a whole, not to mention our society, respond to the Syrian things, the big difference is technology. It makes it unrecognizable. When the teams, we had those teams in one group of them were working out of a group of hotel ballrooms in Lebanon, and the other group were working out of a drafty Air Force hangar in Amman. They were working. They would be all working on their laptops. The laptops were feeding into a server, and at the end of the day, the information in those servers went to either servers at our embassy in Mexico City or servers in Manila, where the work that had to be done was done by the computers. On the next morning, when our people came back into work in the hangar or the ballroom and turned on their laptop, the work was done. Now that is amazing. It is pretty astonishing. Our big thing was ballpoint pen and a piece of soggy paper. To see what the capacity was to do that, but something was lost. And let me tell a tiny story here. There was a very bright officer that with about 10 years experience that I got interested in dealing with. I've been retired for 20 years, but this guy came to my attention because he was a bit of a history buff. And so I used to have lunch with him from time to time. And I got a call from him the year the Syrian thing took off. And he said, "Look, Mike, I'm downtown doing my Christmas shopping." It was October. And I said, I said, "That's a bit odd." He said, "Yeah, well, I'm heading for Jordan. Come down, I want to have lunch with you." So I whooped downtown, talked to him, and he was going to be away for Christmas. So he's doing his Christmas shopping. And I said, "Well, listen, when you get back, I want you to write an article on it, and I want you to think hard about it now, because what you're going to do is going to be different than anything we've seen." And so when he came back, after being out there for 3 or 4 months, missing Christmas with his kids, he told me about, the amazing way they use technology and how, for example, they couldn't fly people directly from Beirut because Beirut airport is controlled by Hezbollah. So they not only had to deal with the Jordan case, but they flew people from Beirut to Jordan and then on. big complicated things, lots of people, everything being done on the refugee cell phones and these computers in Mexico and other places. It's an astonishing story. But he said, this is a guy with 10 years experience. And he said to me, but the best part was once we had to interview everybody very quickly, get all the basic information. But we'd have 2 or 3 minutes at the end of our little session with them where they could talk to us and we could talk to them. And they would ask us questions about Canada and we would tell them. And he said, it was the most wonderful experience of my life. And I said, oh, you poor man. When I was a visa officer, that's what we did. We talked to people. We didn't use algorithms. We talked to people. And I'm sure there was a lot of inconsistencies in our decisions, but there's something human about it.
Mike,
The big change is the fabulous technology that they have, where they can, if you look at the recent edition of the Canadian Immigration Historical Society Bulletin, there's an article on the Karens that were brought to Canada some years ago. And you continually hear about how the UN is putting the applications into our system electronically, that everything's, there's human beings intervening and making decisions, but there's no paper.
Yeah, it is astonishing to see how things have
difficult.
changed and how those tools have made the job a little bit different and maybe affecting how decisions are made, which is a very important consideration.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could maybe, as we move to the end of our interview, talk about what do you think is the legacy of the resettlement program, what challenges it faces for the future, what things you would like to see happen with the program, having all this knowledge that you have from a historical aspect, and what things can be improved upon, what things we should look out for, what advice you'd have for the government, I would say.
Well, in terms of legacy, the legacy is a living legacy. When you look at how well the Ugandanese did, when you look at how well the Vietnamese, the Laotians, and Cambodians have done, I used to watch them getting off the planes in Edmonton and Calgary, and you'd get these men and women with a pair of shorts, a pair of flip-flops, a t-shirt, a little blue bag with their documents, and one kid on each hip. That was it. And we didn't pay any attention to their occupations. We didn't try and say, oh, we're looking for people with this occupation. We didn't know they had occupations. We were very naive. And they were the poorest people in Canada for 20 years. And by the end of the 20th year, they caught up. And they are now perhaps the highest performing sector of our population. And when you look at every refugee group that's come in, they come with nothing but hope and empty pockets. And they've only had one direction to go. So I don't think we ever lose when we resettle refugees. And I don't think it doesn't matter how exotic they are or where they, how different the country is. Our society and our systems are the best in the world when it comes to absorbing newcomers. That's not to say it's easy. That's not to say there aren't mistakes. That's not to say that there isn't a hell of a lot of suffering at the individual level in these processes. Because, when people arrive in Canada as refugees, they think their problems are over. Actually, a whole new set of problems are beginning, particularly if they don't speak English or French. But they 20 years on, typically are doing pretty damn well. And their kids are outperforming those that are born sort of the original population. So that's the big legacy. It's a human legacy, and we get these people whose attachment to Canada is profound. They're proud of being Vietnamese or Ugandans or whatever it is, but they're more proud that they're Canadians. And the open hand that we gave them when they arrived here, the kind treatment on day one carries them through their lives and all the hardships of that. So that's one. What are we looking for ahead? If you told me before COVID-1, I would have had a series of very clear answers. I think that we're going to have to get back in the business as soon as the health system allows. But I think that the medical side of it is going to be a lot more tricky. Early in Canada's history, we didn't screen a bunch of immigrants coming in from Ireland, and a third of the population died of cholera. We have no interest in given that I'm Irish, we don't wish to repeat that kind of thing. So I think that's going to be much more tricky. I think there are some things that we have to improve, even though there are provisions for reunifying refugees within the first year of any relatives that were left behind. One of the things that bothers me about the private sponsorship program is that it has become largely a family reunification program, and which means that the UNHCR's ability to give us cases that need immediate protection is muted by the fact that so many of those that are being sponsored they're certainly refugees, but they're not the UNHCR, often the UNHCR's priority. Sometimes they are, but for the most part, it's family unification. And I really have been saying to anybody who listened for the last decade almost, we need another channel. And we need another channel, not because it's nice to reunify families, but because once a refugee arrives here, whether through resettlement or asylum, to the asylum process, once we have them for life. So what is the public interest? The public interest is that person get established in Canada as quickly and efficiently as possible. And what are the impediments? Well, language is one, but a huge impediment is longing for relatives left behind. And people send money they should be spending on themselves back. They worry about it. They run up big telephone bills and internet bills trying to stay in touch. They pine for them, and it inhibits their settlement ability. Now, when the relatives get here, all the usual family fights and everything happen, but people then can concentrate on the business of taking root, getting their kids into the right places, doing all the things it takes to build successful Canadians. And I don't know how that gets done. We've had talks with all sorts of people about it, but I think we'll have to open up a separate channel that for that, and basically turn to our sponsors, and because our sponsors are doing it. Why? They bring in one refugee family, and the first thing the family says, we've left people behind. And the Syrian program, because we had to move so quickly, so many, that happened a lot. With the Vietnamese program, it moved along quickly, but it was a little slower. And the rules were grab the whole family. With the Syrian thing, they were moving people so quickly that bits of families got left behind. And that happens all the time. But if our sponsors are concentrating on those, and it's very efficient, it's good for everybody that they are, our capacity to deal with the ones the UNHCR said these people really have to move rests on the government assisted program. So in a way, the hardest cases get brought in and sent to big agencies, which do a pretty good job with them. But I think those are the very people that need to be surrounded by a private sponsorship group and the tender loving care that they provide, as opposed to services. So I think that's one of the things that we need to fix in the next little while. I think
I wholeheartedly agree with you. I think a lot of the shift in resettling or using the private sponsorship program to bring family over happened when there was a shift in the family class, when people were no longer able to sponsor their brothers or sisters. I can speak from personal experience. My family was largely brought to Canada through the sponsorship of siblings, and because that opportunity does not exist in the IRPA anymore, that pressure is then now put on the private sponsorship program, and there's a legitimate reason why people use that program, right?
Absolutely, it's totally legitimate. The interesting thing is, when I was Director General in Ontario, one of the things that bothered me was the number of family class cases, and particularly assisted relative, like second brother, sisters, that category. The number of cases that our offices were seeing where the people were brought in, and 2 months later, the sponsors would come down and say, we can't deal with these people, put them on welfare. And that was happening all the time. And it was an abuse of the system. People were not living up to the commitments. And when Jason Kenney came in and saw what was going on, he threw the whole thing out. And then guess what he had to do? He had to bump up the the temporary workers thing, because guess where the temporary workers came from? They came from those second-tier relatives. And so, I would have thought that the better thing would be to, basically sit down with people who wanted to sponsor relatives and look them in the eye and say, these people are your responsibility for a year. And if your sponsorship breaks up, that's fine. But you're going to still continue. We'll look after them. You will support them financially, and things like that, rather than simply cutting the program off because there were some problems. But it's so much of successful Canadian immigration has to do with family helping family.
So I wondered if I see a picture of your book behind you. I wondered if you could tell us the full title and who your co-authors are.
The name of the book is Running on Empty, Canada and the Indochinese Refugees, 1975 to 1980. And it's the inside story of how we brought those people to Canada from the fall of Saigon to the becoming of the new Immigration Act to and then its full implementation in the 79-80 period.
Yes. It's a fantastic read. It's a great piece of historical work. I want to congratulate you and those that worked on the book, and I highly recommend it as a read. And also just want to thank you so much for giving your time today, Mike. I know that you have a lot of demands and that you are continually mentoring and discussing this issue, which is a great service to the program and our country. So thank you so much. And and everyone please read Running on Empty. It's a great book.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jamie. Pleasure to talk to you again. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye, Mike. Migration Conversations is created and hosted by me, Professor Jamie Liu, and produced by University of Ottawa Tech Law Fellow June Gleed. This podcast was made possible with the guidance and assistance of University of Ottawa Tech Law Fellow Ritesh Kotak, Carleton University graduate student Rachel McNally, as well as the generous support of Carleton University and the University of Ottawa shared online projects and initiatives. You can find more Migration Conversations episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and YouTube with closed captions. Thank you for listening, and a special thank you for all the guests who have shared their experiences publicly.